Hello, this is Craig Camp, and welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deeply into Demeter biodynamic and regenerative organic certified wine growing and farming at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley. This is meant to be a podcast for those that aspire to, as the Regenerative Organic Alliance says, farm like the world depends on it. These interviews will be focused on our work here at Troon Vineyard, but will also include the work of other farmers committed to regenerative agriculture. And now for today's interview.
Hi, I'm Nate Wall, the winemaker for Troon Vineyard in the Applegate Valley of Southern Oregon. As part of the replanting project here at Troon Vineyard, we did a lot of reorganization of our vineyard spaces, where we had which grape varieties planted, and we ended up removing some very short rows on the end of one of our vineyard blocks right here next to the tasting room. And I saw that area and I was like, this would be great to kind of come up with some sort of a native botanical garden with all these, to be able to showcase kind of the diversity and the beauty and the usefulness of a lot of the native plant species from our kind of unique ecoregion here. And I just knew that it would be a great extension of the tasting room for guests too. You can just walk right over there, check it out. And so I knew that would be a really fun project, but I personally had no idea how to get that rolling. And one day when I was driving home from work, I saw this sign at the Rouge Public Library where Suzie was giving a talk on native plants of the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion. And I'm like, hey, this is perfect. Let me learn more about just what we have going on here. I'd only lived down here about a year then, so I was pretty unfamiliar with a lot of the local natives. And so yeah, just sat in on that talk, was able to listen to Suzie and meet her. And then I was like, hey, do you do any consulting? I know you have a seed company. What does that look like? So was able to invite Suzie out to Troon, and kind of the rest is history, and the history that we will be discussing today. So I guess, yes, first off, I would like to introduce Suzie, and please tell us a little bit about kind of your background, how you got interested in native plant varieties, how you came to operate your own seed company, and how you got going.
All right, I'm Suzie Savoie, and I run Klamath-Siskiyou Native Seeds. I think we've been in official business for 10 years, but I've been doing seed collection for probably about 23 years. I first moved to Southern Oregon in 2001, and I just started extensively hiking the region, backpacking, really getting to know the flora of the area, taking a lot of courses on the botanical diversity. Siskiyou Field Institute is a local organization that started a long time ago in the Illinois Valley, and I was taking a lot of courses through Siskiyou Field Institute, very technical courses, like keying out native grasses and keying out native mushrooms, things that really get you into the nitty gritty, and you learn how to really identify species. And I had grown up in California, and this area is still part of what is considered the California Floristic Province. So the flora of our area is really actually more akin to California than the Pacific Northwest, but we have influences of the Pacific Northwest. So I was familiar with a lot of species, but this place, being part of the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion, is one of the most botanically diverse regions of the world, especially with conifer diversity, but then we have a lot of endemic plants based on all of the different soil types we have. We have a high preponderance of serpentine soil in the area that produces a lot of endemic species that grow nowhere else in the world. So I just really got to know the flora. And at the time, I moved on to some land, and I was doing a lot of land management on my own land. And I started collecting seeds with my husband, Luke. And we were using native seeds on our own property to increase native plant habitat. And we would do things like, if we were doing fuel reduction in our land, we would, create a burn pile and then just seed into that burn pile, which would then become, a pocket of native wildflowers that over time spread out and increased the population of native plants on our property. And he was also doing forest restoration work at the time, and so we both were collecting seeds for that forest restoration work as well. And we just started propagating a lot of native plants. I was working at nurseries and propagating native plants in the nursery in the horticultural setting. And since I was collecting native seeds for nurseries and for habitat restoration, it just became something I just did more and more and more of for my own land, for nurseries, for habitat restoration. And so then it just made sense to just really start just focusing in on that work of seed collection, because there really was nobody doing it on a like commercial scale at that time. There was people doing seed collection for agencies doing work on federal land or the Forest Service and BLM, but nobody really doing it for private landowners. And a lot of these species in our area, you can't get seed from anywhere, any other source. And so I started Climate 60 native seeds, and I got seed collection permits for collecting on both Forest Service and BLM land. And I also collect on a lot of kind of a network of private land as well, including my own. And I do a lot of what's called seed increase kind of projects on my own land, either in a kind of more wild setting or in the more garden setting, where you're growing native seeds for seed increase, and then you can grow out more seeds for use in other areas. And I definitely am a strong proponent of trying to do more wild tending rather than farming seeds. So I do a lot of seed collection in the wild or in kind of more wild tended situations. So I've just been, we sell the seed packets online. I also provide native seeds for larger projects, and that's where Nate contacted me about setting up a native botanical garden at Troon Vineyard as a demonstration garden for one, to allow people to be able to get a glass of wine and walk out of the wine tasting area and walk around the paths of the native plant garden and be able to be able to just learn about the native plants as they're sipping a glass of wine in a very pleasant setting. Troon Vineyard is situated in the foothills of the Applegate Valley, and you can see Grayback Mountain in view, and you can see the foothills that have a lot of chaparral and oak woodland and native grasslands. So this area actually, creating a native plant garden here is really like, it's easier to attract pollinators here because we have these wildlands at the edges of the vineyard. If we were to have done what we did here in an urban setting, we wouldn't probably be getting the same diversity of pollinators, from pollinating wasps and flies and butterflies and bees and all the different variety of species, because there's wildlands kind of in view and with on the edges of Troon Vineyard. The native plants that we've been able to grow here are attracting a wide variety and a highly diverse amount of pollinators. And so those benefit the overall land, all the other efforts that Troon Vineyard's doing with food forests, all the vineyard activities, the fruit trees they're putting in, all the pollinators that are coming in are going to be beneficial for those endeavors as well.
Fascinating. So I'd love to hear more about that. But tell us more about what are the borders of this ecoregion and what are those, geologic and geographic features that help identify this group of native plants?
Let me understand your question just a little better. So the geographic features of the region and why the species that we selected are.
Yeah, and I mean, when we make a big statement like one of the most botanically diverse places in the U.S. or globally, what are the features? I think about proximity to the Pacific Northwest, representatives from California, endemic species, coastal species, mountain species, and kind of that. It seems like it's the context of the Siskiyou Mountains and of all of these rivers that really provide diverse habitat for a huge range of plants.
So the California Floristic Province as a whole is considered, I think, in the top 30 botanically diverse places in the entire world. So it is considered a botanical hotspot, like the actual entire California Floristic Province, which we are a part of here in Southwest Oregon. And the Siskiyou Mountains, in more specifically here where Troon is located, is at the convergence of lots of different ecotypes. So we're at the convergence of the Coast Ranges and the Great Basin and the California chaparral communities, as well as the Pacific Northwest, more moist habitats as you go north of here. And so the convergence of all those different ecotypes in this area makes a jumble of species and richness that is kind of unparalleled in a lot of ways, because it provides a lot of habitat connectivity. So a lot of species can travel through here because there is such a jumbled habitat type. And so there's a habitat connectivity. And with Troon Vineyard doing this project here, it is also part of that connectivity. So, creating native plant habitat in the vineyard setting allows species that are traveling through, like say the monarch butterfly, to be able to connect habitat. So it's kind of like a flyway, with whether it's migratory birds that are stopping at wetlands, for migratory pollinators or migratory birds and species that are needing habitat along the way. This type of native plant gardens allowing species a stopping point, like a way station or a migratory pathway that they can use along their migratory route. And then also there's the species who may only, move within 10 feet in their life cycle. A lot of ground nesting bees may not travel super far, and that was one of the decisions we made in the garden. I know we'll get into the nitty gritty of the actual construction and creation of the garden, but some areas we decided not to put mulch down so that ground nesting bees could have access to the soil and be able to actually build ground nests amongst the native plants there. So some species, they're traveling far and wide and they're coming through and they're using the gardens, and some species are just really very localized and only exist within a small footprint in the area. So it's providing habitat for both far-ranging species as well as species that are just more localized. But our region has thousands of native species. So I think there's at least 3,000 or more of vascular plants. That's not even counting non-vascular plants like lichens and fungi. But there's thousands of species of native plants, and we only have 90-something represented in this garden. That feels like a lot in and of itself. So it's kind of it's a selection of species, but the selection is representative of the different elevational gradients of the Siskiyou Mountains. So there's species that grow at valley bottom, there's species that grow in the foothills, and then there's some species that grow in high elevation wet meadows, and everything in between. So we're trying to capture a little bit of the essence of all the different habitat types of the Siskiyous, to kind of highlight and show the diversity. So from bulbs to perennials to annuals to shrubs, just kind of giving a snapshot of what's out there in the wild.
Yeah. And there's so much utility out in the garden as well, meaning native plants that we can recognize as first foods. For indigenous people around here, there's plants that there's soap root out there that has usefulness beyond just nutrition. And I mean nutrition for people, and of course for all of the birds and the wildlife that utilize this garden as well. And so that is another, I think, component of the selection of, 90 plants. We're pretty proud of. We're like, more than 90 plants. This is a huge effort, and it has been cultivated over the last 4 years. I do want to hear more about that history. I kind of elbowed my way to the table here today to join you and Nate that started this garden, envisioned it together 4 years ago, and we've been working together, Suzie, for the last 3 years to help manage it, as well as propagate more plants and more seed resources from that garden to disseminate throughout the whole farm, which I've found really exciting. But yeah, let's go back to kind of the beginnings of the garden, and if you could talk about that process that you developed, kind of co-created with Nate, and I think Luke had some involvement in those early days too.
Yeah, so Nate approached me in 2020, and I just decided to come and just take a look at the site, and it was just basically a bare patch of soil. The vines had been ripped out, and it had been very deeply tilled. And at the time, there were some germinating weed seeds kind of emerging in the fall, or I think it was actually early winter. So we just were just evaluating the site of what the potential was. And I don't think either of us really realized at the time what it would become necessarily, but Nate laid out the paths, basically kind of created a path system. And then around that path system, I created a layout and a design for the native plants that would be grown there. And of course, I'm limited to species that I can actually get seed for, that we can actually, cultivate in that setting. But kind of the sky was the limit in terms of, if I can get seed and I can, grow it there, the idea was we wanted to have this demonstration site. So Nate laid out the paths, and from there I had created a kind of hand-drawn rough estimate of what species were going to go where. And when we got on site, it took quite a bit just to get all the seeds together, package all the seed, make estimates of how much seed quantity for each little seeded area. So in the area with the main paths, we were going to have literally a demonstration garden where people could look at a patch of plants with a plant sign so that they could read what species is there and identify it, not be able to just look at it, but see the name and be able to identify it. Sometimes when people learn the name of a plant, they can remember it better. So a visual and plant name. So in those blocks, it was going to be, species that would be individually grown in different blocks. But then in another area of the garden, it was going to be a meadow, so a mixture of meadow species. And then there was going to be an area that was just drought-tolerant plants, primarily unirrigated, eventually completely unirrigated, and then an area that's irrigated that would highlight more moist-loving species. But the moist-loving species are just a small fraction of the garden. Primarily it's drought tolerant, and after the second year, I think we cut off water to it in the third year. And so in the third year, so now at least two full summers, it has had no summer irrigation, and things are thriving. We definitely needed a little bit of irrigation the first couple years to get the seedlings to germinate well and to establish well, and things are pretty well established now, and so we've cut off water in that spot. So when we arrived in the winter of 2020, 2021, I think it was technically still 2020, we arrived with a bunch of bins full of all these seeds. And what we did is we basically seeded little blocks. We had some stakes that we wrote the names of the species on. We seeded that area. And then we just lightly covered a little bit of vermiculite just to make it known, hey, we seeded this spot. Don't come back to this spot, because it's a very big mixture of seeds. I was seeding 90 different species at the time, and we would just move on to a new block, and we got it all seeded in one day. And we did plant some nursery plants just in the moist area. But we also seeded a little bit, a small meadow area in the moist area as well, the area that was going to be irrigated. And at the end of the whole day that we seeded, we did a very light layer of weed-free, certified weed-free straw, rice straw. And that was because at that time, we'd already been getting some rains, and there was kind of, it was clay soil. And there was a little bit of, some rivulets of water kind of moving through the garden area. And we didn't want the seeds to run into the next block. They needed to kind of stay in place so that they were, a demonstration garden, not just a huge mix. So the rice straw was just a way to kind of keep the seeds in place and prevent erosion. But it was just enough, very, very light layer, just maybe a 10 or 20% coverage of layer. Was just very light, because you still wanted the seeds to be able to get a little bit of light and be able to not be covered deeply. If you mulch a seed, you're not going to be able to get germination. And we also, one of the techniques we used early on was to basically seed the whole area also with a lot of Romer's fescue, Festuca romeri, which is one of our native bunch grasses. And the idea with that is that we anticipated that this garden, having been in agricultural production for how long? A long time.
Yeah.
50 years almost.
Yeah, at that point it was almost 50 years.
At least 50 years. There's going to be a lot of weed seeds, remnant weed
Right.
seeds in that soil. And so we anticipated there was going to be a huge weed seed germination response. And one of the ways to combat that is basically using a bunch grass as kind of like a cover crop, to kind of create space that would outcompete some of those non-native seedlings. And the bunch grasses also are really wonderful habitat. They provide habitat for ground nesting bumblebees, bumblebee queens that can nest underground over the winter. A lot of our native bunch grasses are actually larval host plants for butterflies. Obviously, the seeds of the grasses are good for birds. Native grasses are pretty fundamental to wild ecosystems, and so we wanted to have a good foundation of native grasses.
That was news to me, actually. So, I mean, that's something I learned in that process. Everyone always talks about like the flowering plants and how great they are for local pollinators. But, hearing you mention just how useful all these native grasses were, I would not have thought to include, some different grasses. And I think that's something, for people to understand, right, is, some of those reasons you were just listing. The importance of these native grasses was unbeknownst to me, and I don't think it gets as much credit. They're not as showy. They don't have these beautiful flowers, and you don't see all these pollinators like necessarily buzzing around them. So you might not think that they're that important, but like including them is really kind of adds to that holistic kind of potential habitat for all sorts of species.
Absolutely, and like you said, like you may not see the insect activity from the outside, but a lot of times those bunch grasses, they're really thick foliage, and if you were to like actually lift up the foliage and look underneath, you're going to see a bunch of beetles and a bunch of there's habitat underneath there that is really beneficial. A lot of beneficial insects live in the grasses, in the bunch grasses. And so those bunch grasses worked really good to hold space while a lot of these seedlings were getting established. So we mixed things up within the arrangement of plants so that there was annuals mixed in with perennials, so that if anybody's grown native plants from seed before, it's a very slow process for some species. I told Nate the first time, it's like growing an orchard. You're not going to get you're not going to see the fruits of your labor for years. And some species like mule's ears and balsam root, I'm anticipating maybe next year we'll finally get some flowers off the mule's ears and that'd be year 5. Some projects I don't get flowers from those till year 6 or 7. So it's a very long process. So in order to provide a little bit of immediate satisfaction and for just habitat and good color, we mixed in annuals all throughout. So annuals like sea blush and tarweed and gilia and colomia, lots of different annuals that provided color the first year. And that color and that immediate flower response, so we created pollinator habitat in the first year with just the annuals alone. Since the perennials, like we said, things like lomatiums are super slow growing. We haven't gotten any flowers off. Well, actually, I take that back. I think we got some flowers off lomatium tritornatum, which is 9-leaf biscuit root this year. And the lomatiums are like a powerhouse for pollinators, and they were first food as well. The lomatiums are larval host plants for the Anna's swallowtail butterfly, and a lot of really small pollinators use the flowers, so little solitary bees and pollinating flies. So they're a really good powerhouse species. So you want to include lomatiums, but they're just really slow. So while you let those slow-growing species grow, you have all these annuals. And the annuals, since the first year they were seeded, they just keep moving around the garden. Every year they kind of move and shift around in different places. And in places we've had to weed them out. They definitely can seed like crazy into the paths, and we have to take them out of the paths. And in some places they're maybe a little too much in some places. We might weed them out in some places, but then let them go in another spot. Maybe one area we had a species that didn't do great, and so we just let the annuals fill in that space. So annuals can be kind of in a small garden, in a small backyard, annuals can be kind of a pain because they move around and they don't stay in place. But in this setting, they're serving a really valuable niche because they're just great flowers, and they do move around, and they're providing habitat throughout the garden. So the annuals bloomed really great the first year. Some of the perennials started blooming the second and third year. And as the perennials started really taking hold, a lot of the annuals kind of don't hold as much space, as some of the blocks of perennials, like the sulfur flower buckwheat, it's pretty thick where it came in, or the Oregon sunshine is pretty thick in places where it come in. And so there's not really annuals mixed into those blocks anymore. Anywhere where the perennial has really kind of filled in the space. And the goal is to eventually have, the perennials fill in the spaces that will help, alleviate the pressure for weeding, So the first summer was a lot of weeding. a lot of weeding. A lot of weed seeds. As we anticipated, there would be a big response of non-native weed seeds. And so it was, the first year is definitely imperative to have somebody that can identify the native seedling versus the weed seedling. And my husband Luke and I did a lot of the early weeding. We have a lot of experience being able to differentiate the native from the non-native, which is really just something you learn over time. It's just experience. Growing native plants from seed, you learn to identify the seedling. After it gets its first set of true leaves, you can usually decipher what it is. And so just spending a lot of time, really looking closely and weeding out the non-native weeds that were coming in.
And this is kind of like you were saying, a worst case scenario, right? In terms of like a somewhat degraded, long used agricultural land, that we were trying to convert and put into all these native plants. If someone was doing this at their property, they probably wouldn't have that sort of like intense seed bank, right? From decades of cultivation or whatnot, right? So this is kind of the worst that it could have been with that amount of weeding. But if people were trying to take parts of their property and do something similar, it would still be work, but probably much less.
Yeah, it depends on the setting. So if they're trying to take what maybe a garden that they've grown vegetables in for that also is going to have all those same agricultural weed seeds in it. But an area that maybe has not been disturbed as much, or hell, even a gravel driveway, sometimes you can take an area that would otherwise be seen as like a waste space, or an area where you don't envision that you could grow something there, and you can actually grow a lot of natives. Sometimes those really bare areas are actually really good places to get a lot of drought tolerant natives established. A lot of people who grow silver bush lupin, for instance, the Lupinus albifrons, if they grow it in an area that has, bare soil nearby, or gravel, or just some sort of compacted hard space where not much else can grow, a lot of times once it gets established and it starts flowering, it will seed into that area, and it will keep moving around. So don't underestimate, a really dry, compacted, hard site for growing natives. Even those sites can grow really beautiful natives. And the soil at Troon in the area where the native plant botanical garden is heavy clay. You guys could probably describe the soil better than I can. You're more familiar with it, but it's heavy clay. It's the type of clay that when it gets wet, when we were seeding it, you're going to be mucky. You're going to have soil stick into your shoes. You're going to be slipping around. It's that type of clay. And I'd say the majority of the species that we seeded there have successfully grown in that clay. A lot of people, approach me, are like, I have really heavy clay. What can I grow in clay? And I'm like, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Clay is, a lot of our native species are adapted to heavy clay soils. We have a lot of heavy clay in this region. So of course we have native plants that are adapted to that. And one of the really fascinating things about this project that I haven't experienced on any other site, and it speaks really, really well to what this property represents, is that, when we were first weeding out the weed seeds, we noticed all these little bulbs coming up in the soil, and Luke and I were like, well, are these just like some non-native bulb? Like, what are these? Or, are they like grape hyacinth, or like, who knows? Like, we just couldn't tell when we started seeing. We knew they were bulbs, established bulbs coming up in the soil. And we just left them because we were like, well, we'll just see what they are, who knows. And they ended up being native bulbs that had persisted. So the Troon Vineyard site has 2 different native bulbs that I know of: Brodia elegans, elegant Brodia, and Tridalea hyacinthina, which is wild hyacinth, that has persisted on this site since European settlement, basically. And we were just shocked. We actually seeded both of those species, but they were there, so they were able to survive being planted in vines and being really heavily tilled, deeply tilled. And so now this demonstration native plant garden has these established native bulbs, pretty well spread throughout the project. And they're amazing. These native bulbs are amazing. Are always covered in lots of pollinators. And then, of course, a lot of the native bulbs were first foods that the tribes that, would have been living here would have managed for. It's very likely that this area was a huge meadow of bulbs. If they're still here and they've persisted this long, it had to have been amazing native bulb habitat. And so we've been able to incorporate these bulbs that have persisted with a lot of tenacity. They've been able to, so, being a vineyard, I think, there's been places throughout the property where these bulbs have been able to just persist on the edges, whether fence lines or just intermixed in areas where they just weren't tilled or weren't killed through the agricultural process. And also soaproot is another one that has persisted on the property. That's Chlorogalum pomeridianum. Soaproot is a huge bulb. Gets really big, and the root can be pounded into a soap. I've done it before. It actually works pretty good. It lathers up pretty good. And it's another name for it is a mole lily. It produces a really tall flowering stalk. It has these kind of green strap-like leaves at the bottom, and then a really tall flowering stalk with these white lily flowers, and it's night blooming, so it opens up in the evening, and you'll get some some day flying pollinators late in the day when it first opens, and then as the night comes on and all the nighttime pollinators come out, it gets all the nighttime pollinators, the moths, and all the different, mostly moths pollinating it, and then it closes up during the day as a drought adaptation. Much like tarweed does. The tarweed in the garden also does that. So it closes up during the day as a drought adaptation. And so there's all these neat native bulbs that have persisted, and we've been able to take seed from some of the soaproot and other bulbs that are growing outside the native plant botanical garden and keep seeding into it as well, so that we're increasing those bulbs over time. And bulbs are very slow growing as well, very slow growing from seed. So it was really nice to have these established bulbs on site. So,
well, obviously, once you get the bulbs established, right? I mean, pretty impressive just how resilient those things can be. Right? We just mentioned, decades worth of punishment, in some ways, and still they come back. So if you put the effort in on the front end, sounds like they can have a real long-lasting impact.
Yeah, and I any project I've done, I've always my kind of one of the assessments that I do is what natives already are on site. That not only gives you an idea of what was historically there before settlement, it also gives you an idea of what's going to do well there. If it's already there and it's thriving and it's persisting. A lot of people don't realize that how many natives they might already have on the property they're managing. They're there usually. Not every property has natives, but a lot of them do, especially if they're nearby wildlands. Like we have here. There's birds bringing in species. Things are being moved around. Even just wind. Seeds being moved in on the wind. Like milkweeds or whatever. There's species moving around. And so there a lot of times properties already have native plants there, and so you might as well use what's there on site. Nate and I have looked at a little patch of mule's ears that's right on the property boundary, and we've taken seed off of that and put it into the project area. So there's these little pockets of existing natives, so you might as well work with what's there, because that was what was already over millennia adapted to that site.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about like the context of a native botanical garden, a demonstration site within ag land or within an agricultural context. And, you know, coming from a farming background, but practicing biodynamics for more than 10 years, habitat and biodiversity reserves has always been a part of what I'm farming, but it's been in different contexts for me, from Southern California up through the Bay Area of California, now to Southern Oregon. And I'm always interested and pretty fascinated by the opportunities to incorporate native plants within an agricultural context. And we've been talking a little bit about some of those challenges and also how impressive it is for some of these natives to persist. But I'd like to talk about some of the benefits, like why, sort of, at the risk of offending you or asking a dumb question, why is it important? I'll say first off, for our biodynamic certification, it's a requirement of every Demeter certified farm that a minimum of 10% of their total acreage be dedicated to these biodiversity reserves. So at Troon, we've got more than 10 acres of habitat established. This native garden site is about a third of an acre. It's relatively small, humble beginnings, but from it, you know, we've continued, and we'll talk a little bit more about those expansion projects. But first, let's talk about why was this important? Why, Nate, were you inspired to do this? And what are the benefits to ag lands of bringing in native plants and native wildlife?
Well, I'd say that, you know, the best reason, I think the first and foremost reason for any farming or agricultural setting would just be the benefit of all the beneficial insects that you bring in.
Yeah.
So, you know, most insects have evolved and are adapted to some part of their life cycle being tied to specific plants. Some are more generalist. Some insects can only use very specific species. So obviously the most common example people are familiar with is the monarch butterfly using, you know, milkweed. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. You know, so many insects have to have a very specialized plant for their life cycle. And so the only way that you can bring in diversity of insects and increase beneficial insects is by bringing in the plants that they use. And most of our insects are adapted to native plants. They can't use non-native plants. So a lot of ornamental plants you might buy at the nursery, they're basically just ornamental, literally. Like, they don't serve any ecological function on the landscape because our native insects can't use them. They haven't evolved to use them. They can't use them as a larval host plant, or, you know, maybe they just don't provide the same nectar and pollen. You know, a lot of plants that have been, like a lot of the highly bred plants that are like these named cultivars in nurseries, they might have very little nutritional value even in the flowers, because they've been bred to be pretty. You know, they've been bred to be attractive to humans. And sometimes that means in that breeding process, they've lost some of their nutritional value or their pollen and nectar production, and they're just pretty, especially something that's double flowered. You know, a pollinator can't even get into that flower to even access pollen or nectar. So in order to like really attract a wide diversity of native insects, or just insects in general, having native plants provides that foundational habitat of a wide variety of species that they're adapted to use. So, for instance, blue butterflies, a lot of the different types of blues, they use the native buckwheats. Like I already mentioned, the Anise swallowtail uses the lomatiums. I could go on and on with, like, you know, a lot. Like I said, a lot of the some butterflies use the native grasses. There's a whole host of species. I think Pearly Everlasting, the American lady, uses. Like you could go on and on about like, this specific species uses this specific plant. And so the more you incorporate all those different native plants that these butterflies and bees use, the better diversity of species you'll have. And so I think we all realize that the more diverse either a native ecosystem or a farm system is, the more resilient it is to pests and to droughts and to you know, all sorts of different issues that arise in you know, that you're dealing with. And so I think the foundational reason of doing it is for beneficial insects. That's number one. And then number two, it's just, there's benefits to plant diversity just in general. Having drought, like a lot of this native plant garden doesn't take any water, and so what if it's a really bad drought year and Troon has a hard time with water? It's going to have this beautiful garden in one area at least, and other areas that it's expanding, it doesn't have to have any water. It's still going to have all this beautiful flowers. So there's reasons beyond that, beyond just, well, it's actually good for the earth to have these refuges of habitat, but it is good for business. I think it's good for business in terms of people have a learning opportunity. People have the ability to, see how diverse farm systems can actually benefit the local economy and just the actual farm function.
Yeah, and I mean, being so drought adapted, being able to have all those flowers beyond, looking nice, is really even more important for a lot of the local wildlife that depend on them, right? And if it's a drought and there aren't other irrigated areas blooming, like that gives them all those valuable resources in a time of need, intense need, right? Yeah. And then the flip side of that is, part of the design of that botanical aspect garden would be so that homeowners and things could go through and maybe make choices to, if they were thinking about trying to plant some of those ornamentals because they'd seen them in nurseries and they look beautiful, but they have virtually no like ecosystem services, right? There's no benefit beyond looking pretty in front of their house. If they can look and they can walk through, and it's fascinating to walk through at different times of year, right? Because like it changes so dramatically from the start to the end, and to walk through at different times. And that's something else that homeowners want to consider, right, is to try to have these multiple bloom times, but then they can look through here and see how beautiful there's this concept that natives always look weedy or something, or somehow unkept. And like, while there are aspects of that to be sure, they can still be very beautiful, and not all of them are necessarily like that, but like some are. But allowing people to see those and maybe make these decisions, at their own, even small properties, even a front yard or something, right? As like, hey, let's maybe get rid of some of this lawn and put in something that doesn't require any water and has tons of ecosystem benefit, and can also be quite beautiful, and alternating bloom times, and really provide this habitat throughout the season for all sorts of things. And your yard will just come alive with also, because you start that process, right? If you plant it, they will come, and you're going to be attracting all these insects and then all these birds, and like you've turned a irrigated lawn into this beautiful, very useful area, kind of like a you're saying, like a refugia within even a urban or suburban type area. You can still do that. It's like you said, having the wildlands around here makes it much easier, but everywhere pretty much in Southern Oregon is relatively close to some wild lands, right? So if you no matter where you are, if you try to build this, I bet you they will come, and it can be beautiful too.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you pointed out the bloom times of things, because that was definitely, I mean, honestly, when you include any amount of diversity of plants, you're probably going to get a variety of bloom times, but it definitely is intentional to have really early blooming species. So I think the first species to bloom in the garden are probably blowwives and camas, and maybe some of the early lomatiums, and then sea blush, which is an annual plectritis. And then the latest blooming species, I think the rabbit brush out there is just about to start opening. It's not even open, and we're at almost October. And then there's some late blooming buckwheats. There's still blooms out there right now, and I even noticed there's a bluehead gilia that's blooming again, an annual. I think it got a little summer rain, or late summer rain, and it put on a little extra bloom. So definitely having this garden is able to produce flowers from probably March to October, which is pretty good. That's a pretty long window of bloom time. So and insects have a time period when they're out, and their life cycles vary too. You have insects that come out in early spring, and you have insects that are more out later in the summer and into early fall. So when you have a longer bloom time, and you provide that long window of blooming, you provide more habitat for a wider diversity of species. So that's always really important. Of course, there's not going to be anything blooming out there in the winter, but most of our pollinators are dormant in the winter as well. We do have some butterflies that will come out on a warm winter day around here, like California tortoiseshell and California sisters. But some of those butterflies don't actually go to. They're not actually true pollinators. They're using sap of oaks and different tree sap. So they might be able to come out there overwinter as an adult in the bark of trees, and they'll come out on a warm, sunny winter day, and they'll usually just get sap from bark. But even still, even some of those insects that may not be true pollinators, they may use get a food source other than pollen or nectar. They still use the garden for habitat, and they may be getting saps out of some of this of those species, or they're just finding habitat within it.
So I want to talk more about those beneficial insects, which you said was one of those benefits to ag land, but I think it also translates to domestic or sort of a home, urban, suburban environment too, if you're incorporating these plants. I think a lot of people think of beneficial insects as pollinators, right? Oh, let's feed the bees. The bees are pollinating our crops. We're in an ag setting. We need some pollination. And so the butterflies, the bees, the flies, that's one version of beneficial. But I also think about pest control as well and these predator insects. And maybe there's some other categories of beneficial insects you could dig into and open my world up. But I think of those predators as really important. We're a biodynamic farm. We're a certified regenerative organic farm. We're really limited in terms of the types of pesticides and herbicides and things that we can use, which I think is really good because a lot of those things are toxic, not just to the pest species, but to a lot of these other beneficial insects that we're talking about. And so an alternative to spraying, which I think a lot of homeowners turn to, they look to their garden stores, they consult with their garden store, whatever, and they'll get the nasty thing. They'll have all this collateral damage. One alternative to that are to create habitat for these beneficial predator insects. And so, as I think about them in the farm, in a farming context, a lot of these predator insects will survive on nectar and pollen resources until another insect that they might favor eating comes around, and then their populations are here. Those predators are here feeding on nectar and pollen in the native garden, and that pest species might show up in our apples or in our vegetable garden or in the vines, and those predators can jump in and help control those pest populations. And all we have to do is watch, frankly, because we've done the hard work of setting up the habitat. So can you talk a little bit more, not just in an ag setting, although that's maybe interesting to some of our audience, but also to those folks at home. We set up this demonstration garden for folks to feel inspired and pick out some great plants. And if this allows you to also spray fewer pesticides at home or do less pest control, which is going to make your lawns and gardens in your neighborhood, frankly, safer for your children, for your pets, and that sort of thing, what are some of those other benefits of beneficial insects?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. When I say beneficial insect, I think of pollination and pest control, or control isn't necessarily the right word. It's more pest interactions, right? Because the control is some, because obviously there's like species like lacewings that will just eat aphids, or they're eating the actual some of what we consider garden pests or farm pests. But then there's these relationships like parasitoid wasps and tachinid flies. They will actually parasitize a larva. So they might actually like lay an egg in a caterpillar, and sometimes that's a caterpillar you want, sometimes that's a caterpillar you don't want. So the control can be kind of, it's just nature's way of, there's prey, and there's these prey insects, and there's predators. There's predators, and there's just both in the insect world too. And so, a tachinid fly can attack a monarch caterpillar just the same as it can attack a non-native moth that might be damaging crops. So sometimes you want, it's not necessarily discriminatory. It can go after larvae of different kinds. And some of these relationships are very specific, very species-specific relationships. And those are like when you say beneficial insects, it's easy to go to the pollinators because those are kind of the pretty attractive things that are fun to talk about. And the parasitizing of larvae with these eggs that come out of these little larvae, it's not very attractive. It's not really like it's not things that people like to think about, but those are the benefits. Like you have these insects that can attack or like their life cycle depends on the larvae of species, and sometimes they can use the non-native species just like the native, and then therefore it's control of pests in a garden or farm setting. So there's lots of different relationships with insects, and it all kind of comes back to the foundation of the plants. So they can't thrive without the foundation of the plants, or the caterpillar wouldn't be there without the foundation of the plants. So it's a much more intricate relationship than just control, but it's there is a control element there.
Yeah. I mean, and just to kind of call it what it is, you talk about pollinators, I think it's inherently sexy. It is sexual reproduction. You have a big, beautiful flower, you have an insect that's maybe a colorful butterfly that's pollinating it, visiting it. There's something inherently sexy about that. But then, a lacewing chewing the head off of a lacewing, that resonates with a different audience, a little more metal, right? Let's talk about the expansion of this, because we started out with a relatively humble third of a garden, and don't get me wrong, it's a huge amount of work. And just to double down on what you said earlier, we wouldn't be where we were without you and Luke's knowledge and experience being able to identify some of those young native plants and weed around them. Our crews have been learning and working alongside you for the last 4 years, and we've learned to identify some of these plants, but that's really helpful. So I just want to say, if you're going to work on a project, it's really nice to consult with somebody like yourself. Mm-hmm. As we've expanded from this third of a garden, 2 years ago, we made an effort with your leadership to expand into a sort of oak savanna habitat. And you talk about doing a site evaluation, identifying what's there. What we had were, how old are these oak trees? We got some Oregon white oaks, maybe 40.
Oh, they're probably older than that.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah. They could be 60, 70 years old.
So we got some pretty nice, big...
I mean, it's hard to tell because they are irrigated, so they might be a little bigger.
But there's a good canopy. Let's just, to paint the picture, there's a good canopy of oak trees, and they're sort of planted along the border of the property, along a fence line. And underneath those were a bunch of grasses, which, again, to my eye, are kind of weedy-looking, messy-looking grasses, and I think to most visitors who come to a winery see that too. And then within those, you started putting all these flags, and you started flagging these tiny little things saying, don't weed whack here, these are natives. And so, you started to recognize that there are a bunch of natives within this habitat that is otherwise really shady. You talked about, we've got the irrigated site, we've got the non-irrigated site, we've got the mixed meadow site. Now we're moving over to this really shady habitat where so many, as I understand it, so much wildlife, so many different species are really relying on oak trees. Habitat, food source, roots, leaves, trees, bark, leaves, all of that, different elements that these oak trees offer. And then they're also offering really great habitat for those shade-loving plants below. So with your guidance, talk us through how do we start to cultivate, and there's still more work to do here, but how do we start to expand using the seed resources and the plants that may be relevant to both shade and full sun environments, as well as introducing more species and new species to this new habitat? How did that process go?
Yeah, so that's kind of the really cool thing about this native plant botanical garden is now Troon has this reservoir of all the seed and plant material that it can use to increase habitat in other places on the land. Whether it's something easy to grow like yarrow and Idaho gumweed, or more difficult, slow-growing species that you have to be more patient with. And so new areas have been developed using the seed and using some areas came in so thickly we've actually been able to thin them out and dig up actual plants and transplant them into new areas. But in the oak woodland, you're definitely right. Oak woodlands are really biodiverse ecosystems. A lot of species just use the oak trees alone as larval host plants, and some of these overwintering butterflies I talked about will use the sap for food in the winter. A lot of oak trees actually get oak aphids too. It's a very specific aphid that birds and other insects will use for food too. So it's this whole web of life. And within the remnant oak woodland that's here at Troon, a few winters ago, we used a propane torch and burned some patches within it and seeded into those areas. And some of the species that we seeded are very slow growing. So
which is kind of like mimicking natural wildfire, right? That was kind of the intention of using the torches.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So oak. Well, most of the ecosystem around here are very fire adapted. We do have some niches of habitat where there's remnant conifers that need fire refugia. They're very sensitive to fire, but most species in our region are very fire adapted, and fire actually is wonderfully beneficial for a lot of species. It helps trigger seed germination. It helps trigger growth. It's almost like a natural fertilizer. A lot of times after a fire, species will grow more big and abundant and put on a lot more flowers and seed. And it also just helps, clear the soil and set, basically it's, the perfect site preparation for sowing native seeds. And so we just mimicked fire using a propane torch, just burned off these small patches and then seeded into them. And species like Pacific hound's-tongue, which is now Adelinea grandis. They just recently changed the name, as botanists are doing a lot these days. We have a endemic fawn lily here, Henderson's fawn lily, Erythronium hendersonii, that only grows in southwest Oregon and a small, tiny bit in Northwest California. It's very abundant here. A lot of people don't even realize it's an endemic species and that it's pretty special because it's so actually very abundant in Southwest Oregon. But it's a really pretty fawn lily that's a bulb. And so we've seeded some of those, as well as native grasses and some annuals and some perennials, other perennials. But Garett's right. So in that area, there are native grasses and there's non-native grasses that were already existing. And it can be really hard for people that aren't familiar with grasses to be able to differentiate them. So there's blue wild rye, there's California brome that are native, and mixed in is some ripgut brome, which is, you have to be able to tell them apart and be able to differentiate them. And the bromes can look pretty similar if you're unfamiliar with them. And there's also a rough leaf aster in there as well that was already naturally occurring. So we're trying to encourage the natives that were already there, that persisted there in that oak woodland since this area was settled, but then also add in some species that probably were there but are no longer there. So just nearby there's a pioneer cemetery, and in that cemetery it's kind of like a little remnant of undisturbed land. And if you go there in the spring, you get a taste of what was here, because those pioneer cemeteries, because they haven't been tilled or managed for agriculture, a lot of the native species are able to persist in those pioneer cemeteries, and they give you a really interesting glimpse into what was there. And you see a lot of shooting stars and fawn lilies, and fritillaries. And so that's the type of stuff that we're trying to kind of increase in this little remnant oak woodland here at Troon Vineyard. Some of these species are really slow growing, so it's going to be kind of a slow process. But I've been able to see there are little baby Pacific hound's-tongues, there's little baby fawn lilies, little baby shooting stars, as well as some of the reintroducing some of the bunch grasses too, like the roamer's fescue. So that's kind of a long-term process that will just take some time, just like some of the other slow-growing species, lomatiums in there as well. It's just some slow-growing species.
Something very poetic about these pioneer cemeteries being good sites to go observe native plants and native ecosystems that are sort of, in a way, outliving. Sure, there's all this influence of pioneers and colonization, but there's something poetic about this cemetery being a great place to go view native plants and historically what this ecosystem used to look like.
Yeah, it's a snapshot in time from when, if they're really old and they've basically been these undisturbed sites since then, they can definitely provide some really interesting perspective on what was there, or what was there and what could still be here.
we're doing, Suzie, we took a walk this morning, and earlier you said beauty is all in the eye of the beholder. And I think, that what Nate was saying earlier about these kind of, they look messy, they look weedy, they're dried out, they're not as showy in terms of flowers, these sort of criticisms that you might get of some native gardens. Unless you really enjoy looking out your window and viewing wildlife or watching, doing insect surveys or bird surveys, unless that really gets you, that might not be the appeal for most people. Spraying less or like going out there and even doing gardening might not be the appeal for most people. And I'm curious what like, if you could just speak kind of from your heart, what about either this project or just native plants in general that you've really dedicated your life to propagating them and really immersed yourself in this super hyper diverse but really exciting and really unique environment? What does it for you when you look at a native plant garden like we have here at Troon or others that you've established in other preserve type environments? What does it for you?
Oh man, I mean, I just enjoy the beauty like anybody else, and watching the pollinators. I mean, of course, that's kind of number one, but a lot of my interest in plants is just the fascination of the evolution of plants and where they come from and how long they've persisted on land and why they've evolved the way they have. Like one of the species in the garden is waxy coneflower, it's Rudbeckia glaucescens, and it has evolved to grow in wet fens, which is kind of like a slow-moving bog where the carnivorous California pitcher plant or cobra lilies grow in our region. So a lot of times you see them growing side by side. But you can actually grow that species in just a normal garden. It grows in this super highly specialized niche on the landscape in the wild, but it's highly adaptable to the garden setting, which then makes you wonder, why is it not everywhere?
Yeah.
And it's just those types of questions and those types of, I just get really fascinated by the evolution of plants and just why they are where they are, and I feel like it's such a reservoir of species richness that we're losing on the landscape, and so I appreciate any and every effort to preserve some of those species on the landscape, whether it's in the farm setting or in the wild. We have species around here that we didn't experience much glaciation in the Siskiyou Mountains, and so we have paleoendemics that have persisted here since before the ice ages. So you can just think of like how long they've been persisting on this landscape. And then just all the interactions between the insects and the plants and everything. It's just this whole fascinating world that just, when I look at plants, it just helps me understand the world even more. And doing the seed work is a whole nother level, because when you really get to know seeds and the way that plants, the seeds germinate and the way the plants grow, you definitely get a more intimate relationship with the plants and understand them a lot more.
Yeah. Well, I know I speak for everybody at Troon and many of our guests who are extremely grateful to you for what you have provided for us, that lens into that way of appreciating the natural world, as well as all of the practical implications of what involving native plants here at Troon has done for us. Pest control, it's great for marketing, as we said. It's a really beautiful opportunity to show guests on every farm tour. It's the first stop on every farm tour, and we're sure to point out the benefits of the native garden to our farming practices, as well as to native and wildlife and how we intentionally invite wildlife into the farm. So we're all incredibly grateful to you. I heard, maybe it's kind of cliche and maybe it's generalizing too much, but I've heard the saying in native plant worlds that in the first year they sleep, in the second year they creep, and in the third year they leap. Now that this garden habitat is in its fourth year, it has certainly leapt, and we saw that progression. You talk about these slow to establish, slow to flower, might not even notice them for the first couple of years. You might accidentally weed them out. So sorry that happened in the first couple of years.
That definitely happened. Yeah, that happened.
Our bad. But we've really come to appreciate what this native garden has become. And then to take that one step further, to be that seed resource, to be that plant material resource, we're looking at expanding not just that oak savanna and to another area nearby. we walked and looked at incorporating more native plants in our biodynamic education garden. And some of those like weedy, compacted, right next to a gravel road, like, you know, these things have just bothered me for years. It's just, we got to weed whack it, we got to mow it a couple times a year, and there's nothing happening there. These are exactly the kinds of habitats that we're just, for free, essentially, saving seeds, collecting seeds and distributing them throughout the garden, or throughout the farm, will continue to add all of these benefits: beneficial insects, pollination, predators ready to leap in whenever there's pests around, beautification, habitat for wildlife is going to continue spreading beyond this initial 10 acres that we have on the farm. And we owe all of that credit to you. So thank you so much for helping us design and build and maintain and continue to grow this native garden.
Well, and I thank Troon for having the vision and the patience. Honestly, that's kind of the biggest requirement, is just the patience to let it do its thing. Because like you said, some of these species take a long time, and the patience is so rewarding in the end. So thank you to Troon for seeing the vision and seeing it through.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us on the podcast, Suzie. We really appreciate your commitment.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks.
And this episode was recorded in the middle of harvest here at Troon Vineyard, so I did have to step away towards the end of this conversation to attend to pressing matters, pun slightly intended. So I did want to mention, though, my extreme gratitude to Suzie for helping us with this project. This is, germinated from this little seed of an idea that we had here, and it has really blossomed into something beautiful and useful here on the farm here at Troon Vineyard. So again, just many thanks to Suzie for all that you have done, all that you've taught us, and really, expanded our knowledge of the native plants in this region, and really helped make this kind of beautiful native botanical garden that we now have here at Troon. So thank you very much for that.
We are happy to share this podcast from Troon Vineyard, a Demeter biodynamic and regenerative organic certified winery in Oregon's Applegate Valley. We farm like the world depends on it, by growing produce in our gardens and naturally crafting authentic wines. We will be sharing these in-depth podcasts several times a month. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website at troonvineyard.com and those of the Regenerative Organic Alliance at regenorganic.org and Demeter Biodynamics at demeter-usa.org. Thanks for sharing our voyage to regenerative agriculture with us.